I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
King Charles had expected a routine review of his late mother's private records. Instead, he found a sealed letter bearing Queen Elizabeth's personal mark, and a handwritten instruction naming Camilla. What he read inside did not merely disturb him, it sent him directly to Princess Anne. Within the hour, a private confrontation had begun. The palace doors were closed, and the king was demanding to know why his sister had kept the queen's final warning from him. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stood beside the locked dispatch box, staring at the envelope. The box had come from the private Windsor archive, a collection of the late monarch's papers, and should have contained routine records. Instead, the king found Camilla's name across the front, and a second instruction stating that Anne alone would decide when the message could be delivered. That sentence suggested his mother had created authority beyond his knowledge. He opened the letter and read the ending twice. Then he lowered the page and said nothing. Grief sharpened his anger, for the warning was written in the hand he had known since childhood. Elizabeth told Camilla that marriage to the sovereign could never become ownership of the crown, the royal institution, and constitutional authority carried by the monarch, or control over its family and future. Her words were measured. Their meaning was brutal. Anne received the summons without surprise. She closed the folder on her desk, dismissed her equerry, a senior aide supporting a royal household, and waited. She knew her brother would not see obedience to their mother. He would see concealment and betrayal from someone he trusted. The handwritten note beneath the queen's signature carried the deepest threat. It instructed her daughter to intervene if Camilla tried to influence William's succession arrangements, Catherine's standing, or the future duties of the royal grandchildren. Succession arrangements meant the planned transfer of authority and responsibilities to the next reign. Elizabeth had not feared a disagreement. She had prepared for a struggle. Charles entered the private audience room carrying the opened letter. Anne rose, ready for his accusation, but her eyes moved to the second sheet in his hand. It had never appeared in the archive inventory, the official list of stored documents. Its presence told her the secret was larger than either of them understood. Charles believed he was about to demand an explanation from his sister, but first he had to understand why the two women closest to the late queen had been bound together by a secret he had never been meant to see. The letter had been written for Camilla, guarded by Anne, and discovered by Charles, but its true power came from what each of them feared losing. For the king, it threatened the trust inside his marriage. For his sister, it reopened a promise made beside their mother's final papers. For the queen consort, it carried the judgment of a woman whose approval she had spent decades trying to earn, yet could never fully possess. Charles remained beside the fireplace, with the letter held loosely at his side. He had spent years defending his wife against public hostility, private doubt, and the memory of a past the country refused to forget. Now his mother's handwriting forced him to confront a far more painful question. Had loyalty to Camilla ever blinded him to the danger Elizabeth believed she saw? That mattered because the monarch's private judgment could shape not only a marriage, but the trust surrounding the next reign. Anne did not lower her eyes when he asked whether she had ever intended to tell him. She answered quietly that their mother had not given him authority over the timing. The instruction had been too sensitive for ordinary palace channels, meaning the usual system of secretaries, advisors, and official records through which royal decisions were handled. Elizabeth had chosen her daughter because she trusted discipline over sentiment, and because the Princess Royal was known to resist pressure even when it came from family. Camilla knew nothing of the discovery. She sat through the opening minutes of a scheduled luncheon, glanced toward the empty chair beside her, and finally set down her glass. When an aide approached, she asked whether Charles had cancelled because of his health or because of her. The question came too quickly to be casual. It exposed a fear she had carried for years, that one private decision could undo every public victory she had fought to secure. Charles heard that she had been waiting, but he did not leave the room. Instead, he asked his sister why the letter had been written at all. Anne revealed through the documented instructions attached to the sealed envelope that Elizabeth had grown concerned after Camilla requested private briefings about William's future household and Catherine's eventual constitutional position. A future household meant the staff, advisors, duties, and authority that would surround the prince when he became king. The truth struck harder than accusation. His mother had not simply feared ambition, she feared that his devotion might stop him from seeing, when marital influence crossed into dynastic authority, the power connected to the crown's future line. Anne began to name the moment that changed everything, but Charles interrupted her. He remembered the ceremony. More dangerously, he remembered what Camilla had whispered afterward. The secret did not begin with the letter, nor even with the Queen's final months. It began at a ceremony where one private request transformed royal unease into a warning that could no longer be ignored. Months before the letter was sealed, the royal family gathered for what appeared to be a calm ceremony of continuity. Smiles were exchanged, signatures were placed, and the future of the monarchy seemed carefully ordered. Yet behind a closed door after the guests departed, Camilla made one request concerning William and Catherine that froze the room. Queen Elizabeth said almost nothing in reply. But from that moment, Anne knew her mother had begun preparing for a conflict beyond her lifetime. Charles remembered the day more clearly than he wanted to admit. The succession planning ceremony at Windsor had brought senior members of the family together to review future duties, household responsibilities, and ceremonial access, as authority would eventually pass from him to William. Succession planning meant the careful preparation for how royal roles, staff, and responsibilities would move from one reign to the next. Everything had seemed settled. That was why what followed mattered so deeply. Camilla remained behind after the formal discussion ended. She approached Elizabeth with a request that sounded calm, but carried enormous weight. She wanted a permanent advisory role inside William's future household, including access to private family briefings after Charles's reign. A royal household was the team of advisors, staff, and officials supporting a sovereign or senior royal. Her request would have placed the queen consort close to decisions belonging to the future king and Catherine. Elizabeth removed her glasses and placed them beside the papers. Then she asked whether William had requested such an arrangement. Camilla paused before admitting that he had not. The monarch's expression changed at once. Politeness remained, but warmth disappeared. She told her that continuity could not be demanded from an heir who had not invited it. Anne heard the exchange from the adjoining room. Later that evening, she suggested that Camilla might be seeking security rather than control. Her mother answered through a recorded private dictation that fear could become control when attached to the crown. The warning unsettled her daughter, because it showed the queen was no longer judging a single request. She was judging what that request might become. Elizabeth dictated the first version of the sealed letter that night. She stated that Camilla's position must end where William's independent authority began. Days later, she added an instruction naming Anne as guardian after learning through a documented private account that Charles had assured his wife she would remain central to royal decision-making during his son's future transition. Anne finally told her brother the truth. The letter had not been sealed because their mother hated Camilla. It had been sealed because she feared Charles would never enforce the boundary himself. That truth strips away Charles's anger for only a moment, because when he looks again at his sister, one question remains. Did Anne protect their mother's command, or did she quietly decide she had the right to judge his marriage? No advisors stood between them. No private secretary softened the language. Charles placed the letter on the table and demanded that Anne explain why their mother's final judgment had been hidden from both the sovereign and his wife. The Princess Royal did not retreat. She moved the chair aside, remained standing, and told her brother that the secret had been kept because Elizabeth feared this exact moment, when love, authority, grief, and duty would become impossible to separate. Charles locked the Windsor audience room door and ordered every member of staff to remain outside. An audience room was a private royal chamber used for sensitive meetings away from public ceremony. He wanted no record, no interruption, and no witness. This was no longer a discussion between the king and a senior working royal. It was a reckoning between a brother who felt betrayed and a sister who believed she had obeyed their mother. Anne held his stare as he accused her of treating him as unfit to hear the queen's concerns. She answered that inheritance had given him the throne, not the right to cancel a direct instruction issued before he became sovereign. Her words landed with cold force. The monarch had expected an apology. Instead, he heard a boundary. Charles struck the letter lightly against the table. He said Camilla had endured years of humiliation, public anger, and private rejection to stand beside him. His sister replied that suffering did not create permanent authority over William, Catherine, or the next reign. The future household belonged to the heir and his wife, not to anyone seeking protection from the uncertainty of what came afterward. Charles looked away when his voice finally broke. He asked whether Elizabeth had trusted him at all. Anne softened, but only for a moment. She said their mother trusted his heart completely, yet feared what that same heart might excuse when love and duty pulled in opposite directions. The answer wounded him because it contained affection and judgment in equal measure. Anne then pointed to the second page in his hand. She identified it from the archived reference marks as an enforcement memorandum, a written instruction explaining what action must follow if the original warning is ignored. It authorized her to place the Queen's letter before William if Camilla again tried to influence succession arrangements. Charles unfolded the page and revealed the line she had never seen. If the king refused to uphold the boundary, the future sovereign had to be informed without delay. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Did William already know? Anne remained silent for only seconds, but the silence was enough. Charles entered the room believing Anne was the keeper of the deception. Yet he left the table fearing that the true struggle was no longer over a hidden letter. It was over who now possessed the power to act upon it. The crown sat with Charles, but the sealed instruction had created a second line of authority. One built not on law, but on Elizabeth's final trust. Anne held the letter. William stood to inherit the future it protected. Camilla was the person it restrained. As private secretaries searched old registers and legal advisors examined the wording, the king faced a brutal possibility. His mother had deliberately designed a command that could survive even his unwillingness to obey it. Charles listened as palace council delivered the conclusion in a closed briefing. The letter was not a constitutional order, meaning it could not legally command the sovereign or bind the next reign. Yet its moral force was immense, because it recorded the late monarch's personal expectations for the family after her death. That mattered because the crown depended not only on written law, but also on trust, restraint, and the willingness of each generation to respect the next. Anne controlled the original documents. Her brother controlled present household appointments. William held the strongest future right to reject any arrangement affecting his eventual reign. The balance was fragile, and every choice now carried a personal cost. One wrong move could turn a private warning into an open family fracture. William arrived for the briefing without Catherine. Before entering, he paused outside the room, adjusted his cuff, and asked an aide whether she had been informed. When told she had not, the prince answered that his wife must hear the truth from him. His concern was immediate because the letter involved her future position, not merely his authority. Charles watched his son read the warning. Confusion hardened into anger as the future king reached the passage concerning Camilla. Then came the question that wounded the monarch most. Why had she wanted access to a household that had never invited her? William revealed through a documented account of their earlier private conversation that Camilla had approached him months before. She suggested continuity would be easier if she retained a consultative role after Charles's reign. A consultative role meant informal access to advice and private discussions without holding formal power. He had declined, but kept the exchange from his father to avoid humiliating him. Anne explained that this second approach activated Elizabeth's instruction. She had delayed confronting the queen consort because she wanted one final chance to judge whether the request came from insecurity or a deliberate attempt to preserve influence. Charles ordered the household records examined. Minutes later, a private secretary returned with a handwritten appointment entry. Camilla had already arranged a meeting with the senior official responsible for William's future transition. The Queen's warning had moved from memory into evidence, and before Charles could decide whether to defend his wife, the palace machinery began producing consequences that no private affection could quietly reverse. Camilla received the news not from Charles, but from the sudden removal of a meeting from her diary. A private secretary entered, placed a revised schedule before her, and explained that all transition briefings concerning William's future household had been suspended. She stared at the blank space where the appointment had been, then asked the question everyone had feared. Has he found her letter? The silence that followed gave her the answer before anyone spoke. Camilla held the revised diary after the secretary left, and did not call anyone back. Charles had frozen her access to every discussion involving William's future reign, while the purpose of her scheduled meeting was examined. A transition briefing was a private discussion used to prepare the transfer of duties, staff, and authority from one royal household to the next. Officially, the decision was described as a protective pause. Inside the palace, no one mistook it for anything less than the first consequence of Elizabeth's warning. The Queen Consort felt less shock over the letter's existence than over the way it had reached her husband. He had opened it, read her name, and acted before giving her the chance to explain. That was the wound she could not ignore. For years, the king had defended her against public anger. Now the most dangerous judgment had come from inside his own family, and he had answered it with silence. Charles entered without an aide. She refused to stand. He remained near the door until she told him plainly that the Windsor request had never been about ruling through William. She had sought continuity because she feared becoming disposable the moment her husband's reign ended. The future household represented more than influence to her. It represented proof that decades of struggle would not vanish with one change of sovereign. Charles placed the letter before her. Camilla read slowly, then stopped at the sentence, declaring that affection from the sovereign must never become inherited power over the sovereign's heir. Inherited power meant authority passed through personal closeness rather than law or invitation. The words cut deeply because Elizabeth had separated love from legitimacy with one merciless line. Camilla admitted through that private conversation that the Windsor request was real. Then she revealed something the monarch had never heard. The late queen had offered her a path to continued family dignity, residence, security, and private inclusion after Charles's reign, provided she accepted complete separation from William's constitutional household. She looked directly at her husband and said Anne knew. Charles turned toward the door. His sister may have preserved the warning while concealing the one promise capable of changing its meaning. For the first time, Charles could no longer see the conflict as Anne against Camilla. Somewhere between the warning and the promise, both women had protected different parts of the Queen's final intention. Anne entered without an aide, and Camilla dismissed her own staff before the door had fully closed. There were no lawyers, no secretaries, and no brother or husband to absorb the force of what needed to be said. For years, the two women had stood on opposite sides of royal loyalty. Now the Queen's letter lay between them, and the monarchy's immediate future depended on whether they could speak as human beings rather than symbols. Camilla asked the question without ceremony. Why had Anne preserved Elizabeth's warning, but withheld the private offer that followed it? The Princess Royal did not evade her. She explained that the promise had always been conditional. The Queen Consort would retain her dignity, residence, personal protection, and place within the family, but she would hold no automatic role in William's future decision-making structure. That structure meant the private advisors, household officers, and family access surrounding the next sovereign. Camilla absorbed the words with visible pain. She said the arrangement had never sounded like dignity to her. It had sounded like a graceful form of exile. After decades spent fighting for acceptance, she could not bear the thought of becoming a tolerated widow, waiting outside closed doors, while the institution moved on without her. Her fear was not abstract. It came from knowing how quickly royal warmth could vanish once power changed hands. Anne listened before answering. Elizabeth had not intended to erase her, she said. The monarch had feared that terror of being erased would push Camilla toward authority that belonged to William and Catherine. That distinction mattered, because the next reign could not begin under pressure from the previous one. Respect could survive. Influence could not be inherited. Anne then revealed the final part through the recorded instructions attached to the sealed letter. Her mother had ordered a delay because Camilla was to receive one last chance to withdraw the request voluntarily. The scheduled transition meeting discovered by Charles had been the test. Had she attended, the warning would have been delivered immediately. Camilla reached into her handbag and removed a folded note. She had written it that morning, before learning that the letter had been opened. It cancelled the meeting and stated that no future role should be created without William's direct invitation. The message changed the room. It proved she had stepped back before force became necessary. Anne offered to take the cancellation to Charles. Camilla refused. She would face her husband herself, accept the boundary inside the family, and end the crisis without making him choose between his wife and his mother. The crisis turned not when one woman defeated the other, but when Camilla decided that preserving her place in the family required surrendering the power she had been accused of seeking. By sunrise, the private conflict had escaped the palace. Broadcasters spoke of cancelled briefings, unexplained meetings, and a sealed message from the late Queen. Yet the public did not understand the full story until one image emerged from Windsor. Anne and Camilla leaving the same entrance minutes apart, both unsmiling, while Charles remained inside. That single moment turned a family reckoning into a national question about loyalty, succession, and the limits of royal influence. Palace officials moved quickly. They released a tightly worded statement, confirming that future transition responsibilities were being clarified by Charles in consultation with William and senior members of the family. Future transition responsibilities meant the duties, access, and decision-making roles prepared for the next reign. The statement avoided the letter entirely, but that silence only deepened suspicion. Camilla's absence from scheduled transition meetings convinced the press that a major internal decision had already been made. William watched the first television report beside Catherine. He lowered the volume and admitted that he had never wanted his future authority secured through his father's humiliation. The prince understood why the boundary mattered, but he also understood the cost. Catherine listened carefully, then reminded him that protecting the next reign did not require destroying the present one. Her words steadied him, because the conflict had stopped being about power alone. It had become about whether the family could survive the way that power was protected. Charles saw the same coverage alone. Anger rose first. He felt exposed, judged, and stripped of the privacy he had tried to preserve. Then relief followed. Camilla had accepted the boundary without forcing him to issue a formal punishment, a public royal action that would have turned family pain into institutional disgrace. The king knew how close they had come to that outcome. The pressure intensified when a major newspaper published a front page dominated by a photograph of the sealed envelope beneath the headline, "The Queen's Last Red Line." The story framed Elizabeth's warning as her final protection of the succession. That interpretation was powerful, but incomplete. It made Anne appear victorious, the Queen consort defeated, and Charles weak between them. Outside Windsor Castle, a crowd gathered behind the barriers. When Anne's car appeared, the noise fell strangely quiet. Then one woman called out, "Protect the family, not the feud." The words spread through the crowd because they captured the public mood better than any statement could. That evening, the palace announced a final meeting between Charles, Anne, Camilla, William, and Catherine. This time, there would be no investigation, only settlement. The world had seen the fracture, but behind Windsor's closed doors, Charles was preparing to transform his mother's warning from a weapon of division into the final boundary that would allow the family to move forward. The final meeting began with no throne, no ceremonial desk, and no officials recording the words. Charles sat with Anne on one side and Camilla on the other, while William and Catherine faced them across the table. The sealed letter remained unopened between them. It no longer needed to be read aloud. Every person in the room understood what Elizabeth had feared, what Camilla had sought, and what the king now had to decide. Charles spoke first, and no one interrupted him. Camilla would hold no advisory authority, automatic access, or decision-making position within William and Catherine's future household. An advisory authority meant the right to influence private decisions, even without holding an official office. The boundary was complete. It protected the next reign from inherited pressure and ensured that the prince and his wife would shape their own household without obligation to the one before it. The king then confirmed the promise Elizabeth had placed beside the warning. Camilla would retain her family dignity, personal security, residence arrangements, and place at private family occasions after his reign. She would not be erased. She would be protected, but protection would no longer be confused with power. That distinction mattered because the monarchy could not survive if affection became a claim over the future. Camilla accepted the decision without argument. She told William that she would never again seek a role he had not personally offered. Then she turned to Catherine and acknowledged that the next chapter belonged to their household. The queen consort's voice remained steady, but the cost of the admission was clear. She had spent years fighting to be accepted, and now she was choosing dignity without control. Charles faced Anne next. He apologized for believing her silence had been an attack on his marriage. His sister admitted that obedience to their mother had become too rigid, and that she should have revealed the promise alongside the warning. The apology did not erase the hurt, but it ended the accusation. William placed Camilla's written cancellation beside Elizabeth's letter. The two documents proved that the feared confrontation had ended before formal intervention became necessary. The future king had been protected, yet no one needed to be publicly disgraced. Charles ordered the original letter resealed and returned to the private archive, the protected collection where sensitive royal records were preserved. It would not be used against his wife, leaked to the press, or turned into proof that one side had defeated another. The king handed the envelope to Anne, then took Camilla's hand and left with her. William remained beside Catherine, knowing their independence had been secured without destroying his father's marriage. The sealed letter had brought the royal family to the edge of division, but its final meaning was unmistakable. Love could remain, dignity could survive, and the monarchy could move forward only when personal devotion stopped, where constitutional duty began. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.